What's up, guys? Welcome back to the show. I hope you're all having an absolutely wonderful day. Those of you guys watching me on YouTube, you can see how big of a smile I have on my face right now because I just finished recording an episode with one of my favorite people. And I'm not exaggerating. Dr. Adrian Chavez is one of my close friends. He's helped me a ton with my personal career development, honestly. And he's actually the first person to be on the podcast twice. For those of you guys that don't know Adrian, he puts out some absolutely fantastic content on social media. He really focuses on the relationship between nutrition and the different disease states like cardiovascular disease, diabetes prevention. He works a ton with people who have autoimmune conditions. And one of the things that he does beautifully is explain very complex topics in a very simple fashion. He does that, I think, better than anybody else, truthfully. And so in this episode, what we did was myth bust a ton of different myths in the space of nutrition, right? From saturated fat, LDL cholesterol not mattering, blood glucose and continuous glucose monitors, anti-nutrients. We covered all of those topics in a ton of detail, but it's also really simple to understand. So this episode should provide a ton of value and help you understand why so many of these claims that you see on social media are absolute bullshit and they don't really matter. Before we get into it, all I ask of you, please, I will get on my knees and beg, is to just leave a rating for the podcast. These episodes take a ton of time and a ton of effort, and even though there's a lot of laughing involved in these because they're fun, they are really hard to produce, right? And the whole goal here is to help as many people as possible improve their health with real evidence-based, science-based nutrition and health information. So if you guys find this episode and this podcast in general valuable, please take a second to leave a rating. And I would love you even more if you left a review as well. And if you're on YouTube, if you could just like the video and subscribe to the channel, I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Adrian, what's up, my man? How are you doing, bro?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Doing great, dude. I need to congratulate you, man. You are
Congratulate me for what?
you're officially the first person ever to appear twice on the Dr. Joey Munoz show.
I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense.
It does make sense. You were my first guest, and maybe one of my favorites. I don't know. I'm not going to give you too much praise.
I mean, the data, the evidence points to the fact that that might be the case. No, I appreciate it. I think this is going to be a good episode, and yeah, it's going to be really valuable. I'm pretty sure because the things that we're going to talk about are things that a lot of people run into, a lot of people are confused about, and yeah, it'll be good.
Yeah, for those of you guys who just started listening to the podcast recently, you may or may not have heard the episode with Adrian at the beginning. I recommend you do. It was absolutely fantastic. But Adrian was the person who actually pushed me to start a podcast. Because I'm going to curse, I was fucking around with YouTube before and focusing on things like editing videos and like graphics. And, Adrian and I met on Instagram. We had a conversation because he's been doing this for a lot longer than I have. And he was like, dude, you need to forget about all of that and just worry about the content and provide valuable information and not focus on all of those little details. And I'm glad you gave me that advice, man, because the podcast has been going way better than YouTube and it's way more enjoyable too.
Yeah, I mean, you have knowledge, and sometimes we try to we're trying to produce it in such a way that we see other people doing.
Yeah.
But we don't have a production team to do that. Yeah. And you can just provide more value overall just by sharing your knowledge.
Totally.
People get more from that, and podcasts allow you to just get on there and push record and really talk about some things in depth.
Yeah, podcast is the lazy man's content, especially the way that I do it. I just have a guest on and we can talk. It's like the easiest thing ever.
The lazy man's content.
Anyways, dude,
that's funny.
What we're going to talk about today is cool, right? We're going to do some myth busting, nutrition myth busting. I think we're going to go through some of the most common myths in the nutrition social media space and talk about why perhaps they don't hold much truth. And then we can also get a little bit nuanced, right? Because these things aren't black and white. Usually most of these statements have some truth to them and then a lot of not truth to them, right? And the one I'd love to start with, I was thinking like, what should we start with? And I just shared this on my story. Our boy, Paul Saladino. Just shared a post.
Yeah.
Did you see that on my stories with his blood work?
I've seen it. I know
Okay.
because I follow a lot of people
So
who have shared it.
he posted his blood work. And for those of you guys that don't know, Paul Saladino is formerly known as Carnivore MD. And he's no longer just a carnivore. He eats meats and fruit. Regardless, it's not to talk about his diet. The point is that a lot of the messaging that he shares around blood lipids specifically is just really false, right? So he shared his blood panels and his LDL. I don't remember the exact number, but it was like through the roof, like through the roof.
It wasn't
And
that high actually. He said it was through the roof, but it was like 140, I think, or something like that. It really wasn't that high.
yeah, but definitely higher than what's recommended, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it was
so,
out of recommendation.
but the part that was scary is that in the caption of his post, he's saying that you should actually celebrate having high LDL cholesterol. And I didn't necessarily read the rest of it and understand what his point of view was because I just scrolled by. But let's talk about LDL cholesterol first and whether or not people even have to worry about it, right? Like, are your blood lipids a big deal? Is LDL that big of a deal? What if you also have high HDL? Let's go ahead and start there.
Yeah. So when it comes to lipids, what Paul Saladino said, because I want to address some of his claims, because I know that no matter what we talk about, people are going to hear his claims as well, and
Yeah.
then they're going to try to question. They're going to say, "Oh, well, they're saying this, but he's saying this." So I want to address like why some of the stuff that he says is incorrect. So he will often share very specific studies where there's a positive relationship between LDL cholesterol and like disease or outcomes like longevity. And this is in a very specific population. There's only like a couple of studies that have been published on this, and it's just cherry picking. He's grabbing a couple of studies, and it's a very specific population. It's older adults who are getting admitted into a hospital. So one of those studies is older adults getting admitted into a hospital. Higher LDL levels just signifies better health because LDL drops when when you have like a high infection or cancer, any major disease, your LDL will drop. So when you're getting admitted into a hospital, low LDL is a marker of poor health at that moment. And he cites this study, and it seems compelling. And if you don't understand the body of literature on the subject
Mhm.
and you see that one specific study, you'll say, "Oh wow, there is a positive relationship here. There's some truth to what he's saying." And there's nuance behind it that he's completely ignoring. Maybe he doesn't understand it. I think he probably does to a certain extent. And he's just doing this
Yeah.
purposefully because he knows that the diet that he promotes, or the diet that he used to promote, is animal based diet high in saturated fat, which increases LDL cholesterol. And LDL cholesterol is well established as a marker for cardiovascular disease risk. Now,
Yeah.
it's more complicated than that because it's just not LDL cholesterol.
Mhm.
It's not it's the particles. So we have cholesterol floating in our blood that's being carried in different types of particles, and we have what are
Yeah.
called ApoB containing lipoproteins. These are certain types of particles that float in our blood that can get stuck in our arteries, and when they do, they deposit cholesterol into our arteries, and that leads to the development of a plaque. So that the cholesterol, some of that gets oxidized, that recruits immune cells. It's a multi-step process, but if you have higher amounts of these ApoB containing lipoproteins, which LDL cholesterol is a marker of that, you have a higher likelihood of this occurring. Now, it's not the only thing that contributes to heart disease risk, but it's one of
Yeah.
the risk factors that is extremely well established.
Yeah.
Like there's no questioning it when you look at the literature and you actually read all of the studies, you can't question it. But when you pull a single study like he
Yeah.
does, he can make it seem like something else is happening.
Yeah. And so, yeah, to touch on a couple things there, right? Um, Data are misrepresented all the time by people, right? And one of the things that is hard for individuals to understand is, oh, well, he cited research. That's one of the claims that people send me all the time, right? They're like, oh, he cited research. And it's difficult to try to explain this to somebody because it takes time to understand, right? I actually just wrote a great article. I think we'll probably publish it in a couple of weeks on Outwork Nutrition about the different types of research studies and what holds more value and what doesn't, so that you can be a little bit more educated on whether or not certain claims are real based off the evidence that's being provided, right? But one thing I
I
want,
have a podcast episode on that,
yeah,
like on that
like
specific
it. What's the
topic.
title?
It's like my second podcast episode. It's called "Nutrition is a Science, Not an Opinion." I
Gotcha.
think is what it's called, and I go through the different types of science, what they mean, how we can make conclusions.
Yeah.
It might be that one or the one after that. I
Okay.
forget, but it's definitely at the beginning. It was one of my first episodes that I published like earlier this year.
ChatGPT definitely gave you that name because that is way too good.
Dude, that was before I even knew what ChatGPT was.
Dude, so check this out, because I think explaining these things a little bit more helps people understand what's going on, because people are just like, cholesterol, good, bad. They don't even understand how these things work, right?
And then they think people are arguing. Like
Yeah.
sometimes they'll say like, "Oh, you guys are just experts are arguing," and that's not the case. Like
Yeah.
these people are taking advantage of other individuals and harming people.
Yeah.
Like there are people truly. I'm in carnivore groups, in low carb and carnivore groups, and that can be done in a healthy way. But
Yeah.
if you're cutting out all vegetables and plants and fiber, and you're eating a high saturated fat diet and having butter and steak for breakfast every single day, for many people, especially those who are
Yeah.
genetically susceptible, because LDL cholesterol is largely influenced by your genetic response to saturated fat consumption. So if you eat more saturated fat and you don't have the genetics to that would cause your cholesterol to skyrocket, in some cases it won't increase that much. And you'll see these people saying, I eat carnivore and my LDL is only 110 or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just because they're genetically different than the person whose LDL is 600.
Yeah.
And these people have LDLs of 300 and 400. And in this group, I see it almost every post is a high LDL post or another side effect of being on these diets for a long period of time, because this group has existed for a long period of time. And at first, people feel good.
Yeah.
They feel better for various reasons that I don't want to get into now, because that would be a whole podcast episode.
Yeah.
But the long-term consequences they start to pop up.
Yeah. I want to take a little bit of time here to explain LDL, HDL, because people just think good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Isn't all cholesterol the same? I really don't like the name good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, because when we talk about HDL and LDL, and for those of you guys that don't know, HDL is what we call good cholesterol, LDL, bad cholesterol. HDL and LDL are not different types of cholesterol, okay? Cholesterol is cholesterol. These are molecules that transport cholesterol, okay? And so our bodies transport cholesterol in our bloodstream because cholesterol has physiological functions, right? We use cholesterol for producing different hormones, for example. And HDL is a particular molecule that actually picks up cholesterol from our blood and brings it back to our liver. Okay. And LDL is a molecule that is essentially, think of it as a carrier. Okay. Just like you can get in your car and drive around and get off somewhere else. Think of LDL as a carrier or a car full of cholesterol, and it's depositing cholesterol in your bloodstream. Okay. And the reason why that's bad is because if you deposit too much, it builds up. And like Adrian mentioned, it creates a plaque. So for those of you guys watching on YouTube, you can see the animations I'm about to do with my hand. For those of you listening, try to follow along. Okay. So a blood vessel, it's hollow, right? But if stuff starts to stick to the walls of the blood vessel, it creates a plaque, right? So now the blood vessel is slightly narrower. And if that plaque continues to build up, and like Adrian mentioned, depositing LDL is just one step in plaque buildup. It's a complex process, but depositing cholesterol is definitely an important step there. If you continue to deposit cholesterol, this plaque continues to build up to the point where blood can't really flow through the artery anymore. And what happens is the artery can rupture, right? And that's what we would call heart disease, cardiovascular disease, etc. So the reason why high LDL is bad is because you're just depositing more cholesterol in your bloodstream all over your body. And so you have a higher risk of developing one of these plaques, right? And undoubtedly, higher LDL, as you mentioned, Adrian, is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. That means that if LDL is high, independent of other variables, it will influence your risk of cardiovascular disease because it's depositing more cholesterol. So hopefully that clears up the confusion of good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, etc. Now,
Another thing I want
Go
to
ahead
go
there.
into, I want to kind of go off of your analogy and just bring that point home is like, just like if there was more cars on the road, there's more likely to be more wrecks. It's the exact same
That's a
thing
great
that's
way of
happening
putting
when
it.
there's more LDL particles. Like, and it comes down to particles. So LDL cholesterol is the concentration of cholesterol that is contained in LDL particles.
Mhm.
That's like the number of people that are in the cars. That's not as important. It's the number of cars that are on the road, which can be measured through what's called ApoB test or an LDL particle test. Those aren't they're not a part of standard tests right now. They
Yeah.
probably will be. There's recommendations that have come out that have recommended that they be included in standard cardiovascular risk assessment tests. You can ask your doctor for them. They're usually pretty inexpensive. ApoB is the easiest one to get, but ApoB is it's measuring the number of those cars on the road essentially,
Yeah.
and that's what's most important, and it matters. Like,
Yeah.
it's well established, it matters.
Yeah. Isn't there evidence that ApoB concentrations are almost a better marker than?
Oh, that's clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's been established since 2010, 11-ish, like quite a long time ago. That's been the data. Once we were started learning how to measure ApoB, when those studies started being published and comparing it to LDL cholesterol,
Mhm.
every study has shown that it's a better predictor of heart disease and LDL cholesterol. We just didn't know what it was,
Yeah.
previous to that. My advisor during my PhD, she was involved in like some of this early research and lipoprotein subfractions and all of that. So that's how I kind of learned about it,
Yeah.
and I got lucky to kind of be in that environment.
Yeah. And for those of you guys listening, like, what's ApoB? APO, capital B. It's just a protein. It's a protein that's found in the bloodstream on LDL cholesterol, and it's associated with this mechanism that we're talking about.
Each particle
Uh,
has one of those
yeah.
proteins on it. So each little particle floating in your blood has one of those proteins on it. So we measure the amount of those proteins in your blood, and we can know how many of those
Yeah.
particles are floating around.
Exactly. So great explanation there. And I hope people understand now why this whole idea of like your blood cholesterol doesn't matter is so important, right? And now, a question for you, which you might know a little bit more about this than I have, because I haven't gone really deep on this literature. What about the relationship between LDL and HDL? Does that ratio matter much if somebody has really high LDL but also very high HDL?
Usually, high HDL is not a good thing if it's really high, because, like you said, it's a carrier molecule trying to take LDL, like trying to take cholesterol back to the liver, and oftentimes
You're thinking
LDL
about something
cholesterol will
else.
increase
Yeah.
when there's a lot of cholesterol. So it's like if HDL is tow trucks, and there's a lot
Yeah.
more wrecks, so there needs to be more
Yeah.
HDL cholesterol. So it doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing to see more tow trucks or cops on the road or whatever you want to use as the analogy for HDL. At this point, like, there really isn't strong evidence that trying to purposefully increase HDL for any reason is like helpful for cardiovascular disease. 10 years ago, we thought that was the
Yeah.
case. The publications that have come out over the last 10 years have really shown that that relationship doesn't seem to be as strong, and that LDL and the ApoB containing lipoproteins are really like the thing that we need to focus on most when it comes to cholesterol. Now, there's other things
Yeah.
like triglycerides and HbA1c
Yeah.
and inflammatory markers and other things that are important for cardiovascular disease risk, but when it comes to cholesterol, it seems that that's probably the most important, is those ApoB containing lipoproteins.
You brought up something really interesting that is one of the reasons why people often don't trust people in the evidence-based community. And you mentioned 10 years ago we thought this, but now we think this, right? And people are like, these people just change their mind left and right. Or at least that's the consensus amongst the general population. And so they use that as an argument to say, who's to say tomorrow you won't change your mind again, as if that's a bad thing. And the whole thing is like, guys, science evolves. The truth, science is trying to get closer to the truth. But the evidence that we have right now, or the stuff that we're going based off of, may be really close to the truth, maybe a little bit far from the truth. But that's what we have to go based off of, right? And so, yeah, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we thought that perhaps higher HDL concentrations were beneficial. New data comes out looking at more nuanced perspectives, perhaps controlling for other variables, perhaps with larger population sizes. And we're starting to see that those correlations with HDL concentrations don't really exist. So,
Well, HDL, it's HDL function that seems to be like, because some HDL, like just like with LDL particles, HDL particles are different and they don't all necessarily transport cholesterol back to the liver. And so we'll know more
yeah,
about like how to properly assess HDL in the way that it can be beneficial, like probably in another 10
yeah,
years. But what we're seeing now is like, okay, higher HDL doesn't necessarily mean a good thing because it may not be higher amounts of those ones that work
yeah,
in the ways. And I haven't gone into the HDL stuff too much because
yeah,
that was after my PhD and I
yeah,
haven't been that deep into lipids, but I read a bit about it, and we were kind of talking about that during my PhD. Like there's actually ways to measure the different like I forget what it is, but we can measure the way that the HDL particle works,
mhm,
and some of them are working differently than others, and it's not necessarily the total concentration, just like
yeah,
LDL, but it's the way that those HDL particles are functioning, and that's just beyond our ability to currently like measure. Or now we can measure it, we just now need time to figure out what all of that means. And that's why science evolves, is
mhm,
oftentimes it's as technology evolves
yep,
to allow for greater measurement of certain things, and as we measure things the picture becomes more nuanced
yeah.
than we originally thought.
And it's not even just technology because sometimes it's just testing new hypotheses, right? We see this,
More data.
yeah,
Yep.
we see this a lot with, like the fact that people like you and I are open to changing our mind when new data comes out is a good indication that we're trying to be honest and not an
Yeah.
indication that we don't know what we're talking about. And oftentimes people think the latter. Like with resistance training and the resistance training literature, you have acute changes in hormone concentrations post exercise. And there was some data, definitely at least probably like a decade ago now, showing that if you train for longer than like 45 or 60 minutes, there's like huge spikes in cortisol, which makes sense. And so there was this whole hypothesis that like you shouldn't train beyond that because it's not anabolic, you're spiking cortisol. And then there's new data showing that like there's absolute zero correlation with acute changes
I
in
remember
hormonal
that.
concentrations and anabolic signaling, right? So it's like it doesn't really matter. And if you train harder, you ideally grow more. And then there was the same type of thought process with testosterone. And I'm not talking about super physiological levels here where you're taking additional testosterone, but it's the idea if you're like within the normal range, people who have more testosterone are more susceptible to growing muscle than people with low testosterone. That doesn't seem to be true either because there's people with lower testosterone who have a ton of muscle. And then we found out it comes down to the concentration of the androgen receptor, which is the molecule that binds to testosterone and initiates the anabolic response. We didn't know that before, so we just thought it was testosterone, right? So when you discover new things, test new hypotheses,
Yeah.
new technology, shit changes. um,
Yeah. And as you guys can tell if you're listening to this, like um I try to simplify things as much as possible, especially on social media, but things can get really
yeah,
complicated. And that's why it's easy to make up stories,
yeah,
because it is complicated. And so that's why it's really important to get your information from people who have really gone into depth on things. And I, people think that I say this because it's what I've done, but to be honest, I used to be the person that was like, "Oh, you can just learn it all on your own," because I read so many books before I did a PhD, and it PhD completely changed my thinking about
yeah,
things of like, okay, there's a level of depth that I wasn't even close to, and although sometimes, especially on social media, like I try to make things sound really simple, like we do understand these topics like to a greater extent, but
yeah,
that's not necessarily what people need.
yeah,
The unfortunate part is that people take advantage of that complexity in order to make up stories about certain things. And
yeah.
uh, one of the next topic, I don't know what you had next. Do you have the next myth
Yeah,
that you
I
want to
quickly
discuss?
wanted to talk about saturated fat too, since it
Okay.
goes so perfectly with this. But what do you think about glucose, blood sugar?
I was thinking seed oils
Yeah, we
as
can go with that
well.
next too, for sure. But
Um,
the thing I wanted to touch on saturated fats, it's like we were talking a little bit about this the other day. We were texting back and forth, and like there's extremists on both sides of the equation, right?
Mm.
Where like, and it just goes again to people like not knowing this nuance. And honestly, I learned more about this nuance even over the past week as I was doing some reading for an article I was writing. But the people that say that saturated fat doesn't matter are wrong, right? That's the same Paul Saladino crowd. But then the other side of that is people that say that eating any saturated fat is bad for you and grouping saturated fats as all being equivalent. And as we were talking about nuance here with cholesterol and LDL and HDL, and not all LDL being the same, we could say the same about saturated fat, right? All of these things are so nuanced. And so I quickly wanted to give people some really helpful like take home recommendations when it comes to saturated fat consumption, right? Because I did receive a ton of engagement on that post that I made, and people are like, is it bad to eat saturated fat? Is it not bad? My buddy messaged me and he's like, I eat this amount of ground beef per week. Is that bad? And it's, you can't answer that question, right? Black and white with that amount of information. The reality is it comes down to what do your blood lipids look like, right? And like you mentioned, some people unfortunately are essentially more sensitive to saturated fat, where a certain amount of saturated fat will increase LDL cholesterol to a greater degree, right? And that comes down to the ApoE4 allele, perhaps, and then other variables as well. So it's like there's a ton of nuance here. But to say that all saturated fat consumption is bad is not true. For most of you guys listening, if you think you should maybe decrease your saturated fat intake, just look at your blood lipids, right? If things
Yeah.
are fine and you're healthy, you can argue that the amount of saturated fat you're consuming is not too much, right? We can also go into talking about there's just so much here, dude. Like a lot of the data, it's like because people are like, oh, lower saturated fat, but you're inherently going to substitute that with something else. The thing you substitute it with matters too, right? And this can take us directly into
Oh
talking
yeah.
about seed
So simple
oils.
simple recommendations with this
Yeah,
is, if you're, like you said, if you have a high blood lipid profile, like if your LDL's fine, then don't worry about it.
yeah,
And there's no reason to increase your consumption of saturated fat purposely. There's no reason to add butter to your meals or try to eat fattier meats on purpose. Like, there's no benefit to the fats that are
yeah,
coming from animal foods. Like, there is no study that's ever been published that has shown that consuming, butter or ghee or tallow or any other fatty animal foods has any positive health outcomes, like any positive benefits. Every study that's ever been done that has compared that to almost anything, like a vegetable oil or a fiber source or anything,
yeah,
shows a benefit, like for the most part. So purposefully consuming more of those doesn't make sense. If you're consuming, a little bit of butter, a little bit of fattier meats, you like a ribeye like a couple days a week or
yeah,
whatever, and your LDL cholesterol is fine, I wouldn't worry about it at all. Now, if it's on the high end, then those things probably need to be reduced, particularly like if you're having coconut oil or palm oil, or butter, or uh, like fattier meats. And what
yeah,
you replace that with is leaner meats, plant oils, and not, coconut and palm. So olive oil, or avocado oil, or whatever you want to use in terms of the plant oils. Pretty much all of them, except for palm and coconut oil, are going to be fine in
yeah.
terms of improving lipid profile.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to touch on there is like what you substitute with is important, right? Because there's also data that if you just substitute it for more refined carbohydrates or added sugars, doesn't necessarily result in
Yeah.
positive health outcomes either, right? And then it comes down to like, people are like saturated fats from animal based foods are bad. Okay, without a lot of nuance, we can say yes, we can agree on that statement. And they're like, no red meat. It's like, hold on, like not all red meats are equal, right? You can
Hmm.
intentionally buy really lean red meat. Like, dude, I buy 93.7 or 97.3 lean ground beef. That is inherently lower than 10% saturated fat from total calories. I think the 93.7 is maybe like 15%, but I don't eat that on its own. I eat it with some veggies. I eat it with a carb source. And for the meal, total saturated fat is under 10% for the meal, right? Occasionally I have some fattier sources, but I eat red meat often. I know there are arguments that perhaps it's not the best for your health, but in the way that I do it, it really pisses me off when people are just like, that's so bad for you. It's like, man, I'm purposefully choosing the leaner cuts on purpose. I add a ton of veggies to my plate. Like, it is so hard to argue that that is bad for my health,
Yeah,
given that my blood
yeah,
lipids are
you
fine.
can't
And yeah,
you
crazy,
can't
man.
argue strong. I mean, there's a little, you can make a little bit of a justification of like, okay, maybe the relationship between red meat and colorectal
Yes,
cancer that is
yes,
like slight there, like there may be a slight increase in colorectal, but the reality is like you're talking about what could potentially be tiny increases in risk in cardiovascular disease and cancer, tiny
yeah,
increases for your dietary choice. Like it's not, it's too much to think that you're gonna go ahead and like completely remove that food for this minor potential benefit based on epidemiological data.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
it's not worth it in that case. I get what you're saying. But there is evidence
yeah,
that these foods eaten in higher quantities, but even with saturated fat, it's like really there's no increase like from 0 to 7%. It's just a flat line, and then once you get up to 7, it starts to increase, and the 10 is when it really starts to go up.
yep. And then
And so that,
no, sorry, go ahead. You finish.
yeah, so I mean it's not like you have to eat 0.
Yeah.
It's really there's a, and there's a threshold, and that's why it's like there's a threshold that's going to be different for everyone.
Are you tired of spending countless hours grocery shopping, cooking, and preparing your meals? I get it. Time is precious, and that's where Icon Meals comes into play. I've partnered with Icon Meals to bring you delicious, macro friendly, and high protein meals that will make it easier than ever for you to achieve your fitness goals. I understand that you may have hesitations over the cost of a meal prep service compared to cooking food at home. But let's face it, how often do you spend more money eating out because you didn't have time to prepare your food at home anyways? With Icon Meals, you not only save time, but you invest in your health. These meals are carefully crafted to be healthier and more in line with your fitness goals than most of the food that you eat out anyways. So why wait? Visit iconmeals.com and explore their wide array of mouth-watering meals. And as a special bonus for listening to this podcast, use code Joseph10 at checkout for a special discount off of your order. By the way, you can find all of the necessary links in the description of this podcast. Don't let time be a barrier to your success. Choose Icon Meals and fuel your journey towards a healthier, fitter you.
And for me, I know like I've measured my LDL cholesterol since I was doing my PhD. I used to measure it all the time, and I've changed my diet. And if I'm eating, it's crazy. Like my response to animal foods is so sensitive. But everybody in my family has like my mom, my uncles, my aunts, they all unmedicated 300 plus
Oh,
LDL
wow.
cholesterol. Yeah, no, it's like way up there. And so
Yeah.
mine's 101, but I eat a mostly plant-based diet.
Mm,
Like I rarely eat red meat. I
yeah.
eat lots of beans, many meals I won't even have any meat, but that's just how my son eats. So and and I've kind of eaten like that because of him,
Mhm.
and then I get my lipids measured and I'm like, this is probably how I should be eating
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
just kind of keep things where they need to be. Because if I'm eating steak and eggs and stuff like that regularly,
Mhm.
my LDL, even with healthy diet,
Mm.
high fiber, exercising, I'm lean, my LDL will be well over 140,
Oh,
like
wow, dude, that's
150
interesting,
plus.
man.
Yeah.
That's yeah. That's
We talked about
unfortunate.
genetics, man.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's
no.
why I know about the
Yeah,
genetics. Like I know this topic really well because personal experience. Like I
yeah.
knew from early, like everybody in my family's had a heart attack on my mom's side. Like
Oh, wow.
pretty much, like not her, but her brother, her sister, her mom, her dad. And knowing this, like when I first got into this space, I was like, okay, everybody in my family has really high LDL cholesterols. Everyone has a history of heart
Yeah.
disease, and they're all active. They're all like pretty healthy overall,
Wow.
but they've had cardiovascular events like because of this naturally really, so they're all medicated now,
Yeah.
but
They're probably eating too many lectins.
that's definitely the case. Oh man.
Yeah, dude. It's just it's funny, man, because yeah, people harp on these little things, and like you and I have always talked about, they don't even have like healthy behaviors in place that are important, right? Now, for people who like already have a ton of healthy behaviors in place and they perhaps really care about like, I don't know, a 1% or a 2% improvement and they want to cut these things out, sure, by all means do so. But it also, you also have to think about like second order effects, right? For me, consuming animal products helps me enjoy my diet. Two, a high protein diet helps me with my goals of improving body composition, etc. And three, it prevents me from eating other stuff and it helps me have a healthy body composition, which in many ways you can argue is probably the most important variable, right? Like, dude, how many people do you see that follow a plant-based diet for health-based benefits who are overweight or obese? And that's not to discriminate against those people, but it just because you only eat plants doesn't mean you have a healthy diet.
Dude, it's hard.
Yeah.
Like I said, I say I probably eat like, out of like dinners throughout the week, I probably have 3 or 4 with it when I don't have any meat source, and it doesn't fill me up as much. I have to eat more.
Yeah.
Like, I probably
Totally.
eat more calories overall when I do that, because to get the same amount of protein. Now I can use it. It's not that big of a
Yeah.
deal because my energy needs are really high, but like for someone else, like it may be more difficult to stay within their energy needs if they're eating these foods that are, because the only way you get protein in plant-based foods is through, unless you're using like, the protein type, or like the fake meats and stuff like that. But the only way you're going to get protein is through, tofu or beans and lentils,
Yeah.
and those are all, higher in fiber. They're all, and it's hard to get enough protein
Yeah. You need a lot of beans to get 50
within a
grams.
calorie amount. Like, that has to represent a large portion of your plate,
Yeah.
and then it sometimes, like, it's hard to do. Like, I've been
Yeah.
doing, plant-based meals and stuff like that, and I've experimented with that with my diet a lot. So I did that a little bit in my 20s too, and it's more difficult to get the same amount of protein. I end up, the only way I do it is I'll have like yogurt with protein powder, and that's like 40 grams
Yeah.
Greek yogurt with protein powder, and that'll just
Yeah. I was going to
cover.
ask you if you use whey protein or not.
Yeah. So that's how I can just, and it's easier for me because my son is vegetarian, so
Yeah.
it's just easier for me that way. But yeah, that's what I would do. But it's just more difficult, and I don't think anyone should be encouraged, and you shouldn't be afraid of having red meat or animal foods. Like, it's not this really strong evidence that
Yeah.
it's going to cause any harm. It's pretty weak evidence that it may cause some slight increases, that it's like a 2% increase risk if you're eating lean red meat. Like, it's
Yeah. And then
very
you can
little.
argue that potential benefits if eating in this fashion, because listen, this is what I try. It's nuanced, right? Like, do I recommend a diet that's mainly meat and fruit? No, right? Not at all. That's not what I would recommend as the healthiest diet, and cutting out veggies and cutting out things like legumes that are incredibly helpful, and dairy and whole grains, etc. However, I do recognize that that provides a certain amount of structure for some people that helps them lose weight if they have to lose weight, and helps them have a healthier body composition and does result in improvements in health outcomes. Right? So it's like,
We can't talk about that topic though, because that's like a whole
yeah,
a whole podcast as
it,
well. Because
it is.
that is what he promotes now, is what is, like, it is really close to what's called a Crohn's disease exclusion diet, and that's why it works for some people. Is because you'll see the people it works for. It's people with digestive issues, and people who have
Yeah.
oftentimes Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And it's a low residue diet. It's taking out a lot of the fiber, taking out a lot of the plant, like, structure, because you're taking out a lot of those vegetables, the hard, like broccoli, that's really hard to break down. So you're making it much easier for the digestive tract
Yeah.
to digest those foods. That's when I saw him like start promoting his new diet. I'm like, that is, I get why, like, there's great explanations for why this works.
Yeah.
And those of you who don't know, because I think you and I just started talking without giving the context, is like, Carnivore MD, who is Paul Saladino, who we were talking about earlier. He promotes a diet that's mostly meat and fruit and rice, and
I
that
don't think rice.
diet
I think
is,
it's just meat and fruit.
no, he has rice,
Okay. Okay.
I'm pretty sure, or used to, but that's part of that diet too. It's like anything that doesn't have a lot of fiber, and the fruit has fiber, but it's not like
It's
as
minimal. Yeah.
as difficult to break down as like and there's less than like
Yeah.
what you're going to get from veggies. You get more energy to the amount of fiber, which is what you need to be doing if you have a digestive issue that is causing you to have a hard time like absorbing nutrients and stuff, which
Yeah.
is Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis.
Yeah.
So these people, so unfortunately, like when those people come across this content and they see that and they do it, they think he has a secret, secret information. If they worked with a good dietitian who specialized in Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, they would bring that up as an option
Yeah.
in most cases.
Yeah. I wasn't even referring to GI conditions though. Like, let's say, somebody following a standard American diet is probably 40, 50 pounds
Oh
overweight.
yeah.
You give them some general structure of like, hey, just eat more unprocessed meat and more fruits. And doing that, they enjoy because they like eating meat. And they're like, okay, I could eat some steak. Hey, maybe choose some leaner cuts of steak, right? Just have some sirloin, have some ground beef that's leaner. Yeah, I could do that easy. I enjoy that. And that person significantly reduces their processed food consumption, drops 40 or 50 pounds. They can eat plenty of fruit, which helps curb their cravings for sweets. Is that optimal? No. But would I discourage that? No, because that helped that person, right? Like it's like
Yeah.
people want to fucking argue like being optimal. It's like, listen, we're just trying to give recommendations that improve people's health, right? And for some people, it can be beneficial to eat more meat, and if if it reduces processed food consumption and they have excess body fat, right? It's nuanced, man. That's what I'm trying to get
And
to.
it
It's
manages their
context
hunger.
specific.
That's where it works.
Yeah, man.
It manages their hunger. It's a protein. Oftentimes, it helps manage hunger, and um, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I don't disagree with that. It's not harming people's health when you look at it from the multiple
yeah,
aspects, and that's where it's just the lack of nuance that exists on social media, and that's why these discussions on the podcast
dude.
with more nuances are
Yeah.
helpful.
I had friends in undergrad who, for whatever reason, saw stuff or whatever, and they wanted to significantly reduce how much meat they were consuming. There's friends of mine that like cared about lifting and stuff too, and so then like instead of eating a piece of chicken, they started eating like those like Lenny and Larry cookies that are like 16 grams of protein for 400 calories and like 50 grams of sugar. And it's like, that is not a good substitution. Like, sure, it is plant based, but that is not a good substitution from a health based perspective, from a protein per calorie quantity, from a hunger and satiety regulation standpoint, But it's this whole idea of like, oh, if I reduce meat consumption, it's healthier. Anyway,
Nutrient standpoint, yeah,
yeah,
you could go on and on.
I feel like we've been beating this meat horse. That sounds so wrong. We've been beating a dead horse with this meat topic. That sounds better.
Oh my
Um,
god, that still sounds bad. You've been beating a dead horse with this meat talk.
yeah, we're not beating horse meat, I promise. But anyways, let's talk about seed
Jesus
oils.
Christ. I can't even focus after
That should
that.
be the topic.
So seed oils, they're inflammatory, they cause cancer, they cause heart disease, they cause inflammation and autoimmune disease. Like that's, I can't tell you how many different claims I've seen about seed oils.
Industrial seed oils.
Industrial, highly processed. You'll see all these words placed in front of them. And like you can say industrial for butter. Like industrial butter.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
so dumb.
And we're cracking up, but
reason,
it's a serious topic. It is a serious issue.
Yeah, it is a serious topic because I know that there's probably a lot of people listening who have heard this and have heard great justifications. Again, just like with the LDL cholesterol, you've heard great justifications of why this might be true. And with seed oils, there's a lot of different ways that people will frame it. A lot of them are storytelling, and we really just need to get away from storytelling. Like focus on data, focus on outcomes that people can show you as opposed to storytelling. Because you'll hear, well, this is industrialized, the words they use, and then they'll also talk about how this can be used as fuel, or it was used as fuel in ships at some point. So you'll hear that, and then you'll hear like there's a How It's Made episode where they made like some really highly processed like vegetable oil type of stuff, and so people will share clips of that where it looks really gross. If you saw how your water was processed, it would look gross, and you would be scared to drink water. Like they just it's taking these little emotional things that don't really speak to the actual topic. Like the actual topic is, if I eat these things, does it have a positive or negative impact on my health? And then so we have to first get past all of those stories that are being told, and then some people will actually tell some things that have some slight truth to them. So you'll hear Americans have eaten more seed oils and we've gotten fatter. That's true for sure because seed oils have been placed into all of the processed foods that have come out over the last 30 or 40 years because they're cheap and they are just part of most processed
Yeah.
foods. So people eat more seed oils, we got fatter. We just ate more processed foods and we moved less and we had access to more food and it was all around us, and being obese became more like socially acceptable. Like a lot of things happened over this period of time as opposed to like just just being like just seed oils.
Yeah.
And so that's a
Compounding
big one.
variables, and we'll explain
Yeah,
those.
exactly. That's a big one. The people say omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory because the omega-6 fatty acid, alpha linoleic acid that comes in the seed oils, it can get converted into arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid can go down a pro-inflammatory pathway where it can get converted into like pro-inflammatory molecules. This requires multiple steps and like just because we eat that oil doesn't mean that it goes down that pathway and causes that inflammatory response. So
Yeah.
you'll hear that, and this is something that this is called like. And anytime you see this, you want to just be a little bit skeptical when someone focuses in on a mechanism like this,
Yeah.
because um, at the end of the day, what matters is how it impacts the outcomes on our health. Is it increasing inflammation? Is
Yeah.
it causing, heart disease? Is it contributing to established negative health outcomes? Because when we look at mechanisms, this is just a very specific snapshot of a lot of shit that's going on.
Or of
Like
one
so,
thing that could happen, right?
yeah, could happen, and if it does happen, it's one thing that of a lot of stuff that's going on at the
Right.
same time. Like for example, insulin, because it causes fat to be stored. Insulin causes fat gain
Yeah.
because that's one of the mechanisms through that insulin has. When it binds to fat cells, it causes the uptake of fatty
We'll
acids.
talk about glucose next.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it's just
It's
these
more complex than
mechanisms.
that.
When people dial in on mechanisms, just be skeptical.
Yeah.
Sometimes they might be giving you good information, but oftentimes people are focusing on mechanisms because they don't have the outcome data,
Yeah.
because the outcome data doesn't exist and it doesn't agree with what they're trying to tell you.
Yeah.
And you'll see that very often with this seed oil topic. People will say ALAs are pro-inflammatory, or the linoleic acid, not alpha linoleic acid. I said alpha
Yeah.
linoleic acid on accident earlier. Linoleic acid are pro-inflammatory, and it's just not. Like this fatty acid that's in these seed oils is not pro-inflammatory. They are processed, some of them using industrial methods, quote unquote. Um, that doesn't mean they're harmful. They've been tested in clinical trials and have shown to not be harmful. And you can also get cold pressed canola oil or
Yeah.
peanut oil or any other type of oil if you want as well, and it doesn't go through these processes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
A ton of stuff to talk about there because you've obviously talked a lot about these things and you're passionate about it, so you say a million things at once. A couple things I want to touch on here so it's clear, right? What you mentioned, that just because something can go down a certain pathway doesn't mean it will, right? When people talk about mechanisms, for example, omega-6 fatty acids being converted into arachidonic acid, producing pro-inflammatory cytokines. That is one mechanism. Our physiology is an orchestra, essentially, a symphony of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different mechanisms happening simultaneously, and these mechanisms interacting with each other as well. So when you do a cell culture study and look at one mechanism in isolation, it does tell you a little bit of what is one of the things that can happen, but it does not tell you what's going on in the entire body, right? One perfect analogy here is when people, because one of the arguments, at least in like the bodybuilding and space and stuff like that, for to tell people to eat more cholesterol, it's like, well, our bodies use cholesterol to produce testosterone, and that's true. Cholesterol is a precursor for testosterone. But just because you eat more cholesterol doesn't mean you produce more testosterone, right? Because there are regulatory steps as well. Like if you have enough testosterone, your body is not going to upregulate mechanisms to produce more testosterone just because you have more cholesterol. The cholesterol is going to be used for other stuff because guess what? Cholesterol can be used for a million different things, right? And omega-6 fatty acid can become a pro-inflammatory, can go down a pro-inflammatory pathway, but it can also just be used for energy production, right? It's a fatty acid. We use them for producing energy. So that's really, really important to mention, because people hyper focus on these mechanisms. It's like, guys, take a step back and just look at outcome data. Outcome data is when you give somebody something, measure the thing you're trying to measure, right? If you're going to say omega-6 increases inflammation, don't talk about the mechanism. Just give people omega-6 and measure inflammatory molecules. And guess what? Inflammatory molecules don't really increase. There's probably a ton of different regulatory steps that regulate somebody's baseline or homeostatic level of inflammatory molecules. One of those is the amount of adipose tissue you have, right? Your body fat percentage. It's so complex, right? Just like, because you eat more carbs doesn't mean your blood sugar is going up. Why? Because there's a bunch of regulation around that, even though.
Let's cover that one.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to touch here on seed oils is this idea of the processing shit that you mentioned, right? Like, they're bleached. Is bleach one of the steps in the processing of seed oils?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, maybe bleaching or whatever. And people are like, these are toxic processes. Listen, when foods are bleached, they also completely remove the bleach. There is no bleach in the final product, right? It's an argument that is kind of silly, because just because something goes through a certain process,
like we drink, like if your drinking water at some point like was like
sewer water, right?
yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Like
exactly. And the processes that it has to undergo to clean it and remove all of the dangerous stuff is probably stuff that would be dangerous if you just consume, right? Like, we're not saying you should eat bleach, and just because something has been bleached doesn't mean there's any bleach in it. But the way that people present it, it's like, oh, these products are bleached. Okay, now is there any bleach in the final product? No, because it undergoes other processing
it
steps to
sounds
remove it.
scary.
Yeah.
That's where I say the easy way, because I get sent this stuff all the time. It's like, is this true? Is this true? Because when you do myth busting content, people will start to like want you to bust every myth that they come across. Like they just want you to be like their personal myth buster or whatever. And it's like, just stop listening to people who tell stories like this or who focus on mechanisms, and start listening to people who are talking about outcomes. And stop listening to people who aren't well educated in the topic, and start listening to people who are well educated and who have spent the time that it takes to develop the expertise in this topic. And if you do that, you'll be okay. Like nutrition will get really simple for you. Like, because it's not that complicated. I mean, it can be complicated. It's complicated if you're working on this side of things and you have to deal with someone who has Crohn's disease or some other autoimmune condition, or you have to deal with some of this stuff. Yes, it can get really complicated. And if you're dealing with very specific issues, it can get more complicated. But the basics that everyone needs to be focusing on are really simple, but most people are just completely distracted by fasting protocols and glucose monitors and trying to avoid specific ingredients in every food. So you're having to read all the ingredients and you're not even paying attention to your energy intake, which is more important.
Yeah.
Like, because energy intake is probably one of the most important things when it comes to our health long term. Like if you're overeating consistently, your body will store that energy. That energy stored will eventually, over time, will contribute to, like Joey said earlier, like the production of inflammatory molecules that are going to be released into the bloodstream and negatively impact health in various ways. And that's going to negatively impact metabolism, because overconsumption of energy will lead to filling up of your muscle lipid stores as well, and your muscles won't respond to glucose properly, and that will lead to high levels of glucose, high levels of triglycerides in the blood, and all of that comes from excess energy, not from BHT or whatever ingredient that Food Babe or Bobby Flay scared, Flav City or whatever that guy's name is, scared people.
It's Bobby approved, baby. I'm putting out a video on Bobby real soon. Dude, I heard a great quote, and it goes something like this. It was like, your physiology is really complex, so your nutrition can be really simple. And it just means like, just don't fucking overthink it so much, eat whole foods. And the thing is, like, our message isn't that appealing because it is so simple, but it's like, your body will, like, it's like, when people are like, don't eat fat because it causes fat. Well, carbs can be converted into fat if you eat too many of them. Like all of these mechanisms are so complex to where like how you eat and what you eat doesn't make a huge impact because your body's going to use the food efficiently to do the shit it needs to do, right? So I do think excess energy is probably the number one thing people need to focus on. And if eating a certain way that isn't optimal for health because of XYZ reason helps you improve your body composition and lower adiposity if you have excess fat, that's probably going to be helpful for your overall health, right? Because essentially it seems like inflammation is a contributing factor, large contributing factor to all these diseases: cardiovascular disease, diabetes.
It's the metabolic effect
Yes.
more than the inflammatory effect.
Yeah. Well, it's because in
It's
many ways, a lot of these inflammatory markers influence the metabolic pathways as well,
yeah.
right? So, and the thing is, when you have more body fat, your body fat, one, changes its secretory profile. Like it will inherently secrete more of these pro inflammatory molecules. We don't necessarily know why. There's a couple of mechanisms we think
When it
might be why, right? Like I think one of them is like the like cramming of adipose tissues themselves. But do you know why phenotypically they change and produce more inflammatory
So
molecules?
sometimes because there's a lack of blood flow and hypoxia,
Yes.
so there's
Yep.
actually cell death and there's a recruitment of immune
Yep.
cells to there, and that leads to just massive levels of
Yeah.
inflammation. That's higher levels of obesity is more likely for that to occur. The other side of it is once those adipose tissue get um, over full, essentially, they'll start to
Yeah.
each each adipose like each fat cell has a certain capacity
To store
to
fat.
to to store fat, and once we over exert that capacity and we can't put on more fat, and that varies from person to person. Like people who can put on a lot of fat, they're metabolically protected at first. Like once when they're first gaining fat, if they just gain it really easily, it's because the excess energy goes into storage instead of circulating in the bloodstream, and it's harmful when it circulates in the bloodstream. Like that's why excess energy is important or harmful, is because if we have too much glucose and lipids and triglycerides in our blood, that's going to cause every negative health outcome imaginable, like cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's. Everything is going to be increased from those energy, like
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
energy sources being circulating at high levels in our blood. And so that's why excess energy is such an issue. Not necessarily because it causes us to get fat, it's because if it circulates in our blood, and so the fat is actually protecting us until it gets too full, and then it starts to just spill. So
Yeah.
it's once it gets too full, it starts to spill triglycerides
Yeah.
into the bloodstream like crazy too. So it's just releasing all of these inflammatory cytokines and triglycerides, and it's insulin resistant, so it doesn't take up any glucose in it,
Yeah.
which it normally would. And
It's
so
important to point out that like the fat itself can also be harmful, right? It's twofold. Because if you're producing more of these inflammatory molecules, particularly things like TNF alpha, interleukin 6, these are just inflammatory molecules that your fat will produce when you have excess body fat. They mechanistically downregulate the actions of insulin, for example. They have effects on the insulin receptor not being as sensitive. That's insulin sensitivity being influenced, right? They can influence sensitivity to atherosclerosis. I always mess up when I say atherosclerotic plaque buildup, right? Because some of these inflammatory molecules are associated in the recruitment of immune cells to the target site, which again, depending on the type of cell, depending on what's going on in the environment, can contribute to atherosclerosis. So it's so complex, but it's twofold, right? Excess energy circulating in the blood is bad. And then if you have excess fat, it compounds on top of that because
oh
the
yeah, yeah.
mechanisms that are needed to clear the energy from the blood are compromised because of these inflammatory molecules as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. I didn't want to say, I didn't mean that that was the only thing, but
Yeah,
that's where, like, because the fat cells start just dumping fat into
yeah,
the bloodstream. It's just like there's so much glucose and lipids and triglycerides and free fatty acids and free amino acids as well. That one's not, like, if you measure amino acids in the bloodstream, it correlates with negative health outcomes as well.
I didn't know that.
Uh, it's just energy.
Yeah,
Any energy source, when we look, when there's high amounts of basically any energy source in the bloodstream, there's a correlation with negative health
yeah,
outcomes. Yeah, I haven't looked into this data in a long time, like since my PhD, but I had seen multiple studies that were looking at, they were trying to use amino acids as biomarkers for negative health outcomes because there was a
Yeah.
correlation between, and it was, I was just like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just excess energy overall.
Important to mention, though, that high levels of energy in the blood are only an issue when it's chronic, right? And this is
Yes.
a good transition into talking about blood sugar regulation, because we're talking about like, oh, if your blood sugar levels are high, it's bad. Not acutely, chronically, right? That means like you wake up in the morning, you haven't eaten, your blood sugar is high. And it's been like that for months. That's bad. You eat some carbs, your blood sugar goes up. That's not bad. Or at least it's not inherently bad, right? So let's talk about that, man, because these
Yeah.
continuous glucose monitors are so popular. And I've heard even people make the argument. I have one client in particular who is using one, and we've had this conversation, like just why, right? And because some people now are arguing, they're like, yeah, like if you're healthy, you don't have to worry so much about blood sugar and stuff, but a continuous glucose monitor is a great learning tool to see what's going on with your glucose. And I'm like, what is there to learn? Because the only thing you really need to look at is like chronic glucose concentration, hemoglobin A1C. Like, though I can't wrap my head around it, because at the end of the day, it's going to promote a reduction in carbohydrate consumption, specifically quickly digesting carbs. And fruits fall into that category, right? So when you use that logic, I'm just like, there's nothing to learn about. And it just doesn't make sense because it's going to encourage what I would say are unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah, it can push you away from healthier choices for sure. And as you mentioned, and this all ties in really well to the traffic analogy that we were talking about earlier. So if we're talking about we said LDL cholesterol is cars on the road. Well, so is glucose, and so are triglycerides and all the other energy sources. They're all cars on the road that can contribute to
One's a
damage
Toyota,
and,
one's a
and
Kia,
destruction.
one's a Nissan.
Yeah, exactly. And so um we don't want zero, like we're never going to get to zero cars on the road because we have to transport these energy sources throughout our body.
Yep.
The goal is not to get to the lowest amount of cars on the road as possible. It's to make sure that it never gets too jam packed or that those levels are too high. And what's happening with this glucose monitor is a lot of people they're pathologizing. They're thinking that the glucose level that is a completely normal response to eating carbohydrate containing foods is something that's harming their health.
Yeah.
So if your glucose level is 90 at baseline and it goes up to 140, 150, if you're following these people who are, glucose spike people who talk about this all the time, like the glucose goddess and all the other people who followed her lead, you will think that that's harming your health.
Yeah.
But the reality is that if it goes up to 150 because you ate a bunch of carbs and it comes back down, that's fine.
Yeah.
It's not an issue. Your body can handle that. And that's the problem, is people are saying, "Oh, well, that spiked my glucose." And so then they're scared to eat something, and that will lead you away. Like, for example, if I ate a bowl of watermelon right now, or a bowl of grapes, my glucose will probably go up to 130, 140, 150 possibly.
Yeah.
It's going to go right back down because it wouldn't go right back down if I had a burger and fries before this, but I haven't eaten since this morning, and I exercised this morning, so it'll go up and it'll get completely wiped out of my bloodstream in minutes. And that is not a problem.
Yeah.
And what these people are doing who are promoting these glucose monitors, and the way that they're promoting it is they're turning that into, they're making people afraid of these small increases when we eat carbohydrate containing foods that are completely normal.
Hey guys, some of you may not know that I'm the scientific advisor for a supplement company called Outwork Nutrition. I help with the formulation of new products to help ensure that they're effective and backed by science. Unlike many other supplement companies out there, we don't rely on exaggerated claims or flashy marketing tactics. Instead, we let the science speak for itself. We take pride in formulating products that deliver real results, helping you achieve your fitness goals in a meaningful way. If you're in the market for supplements like protein powder, pre-workout, or recovery products, make sure to check us out at outworknutrition.com. And as a thank you for being an avid listener of this podcast, use code Joey for an exclusive discount at checkout. You can find the link to our website down in the description of this podcast episode. Remember, our goal is to empower you with science-backed supplements that truly make a difference. Choose Outwork Nutrition and elevate your fitness to new heights. Yeah, so fantastic information there. And I wanted to even talk about the analogy that you mentioned on cars, about cars and the highway for a little bit, because glucose itself acutely is not an indicator of health. We look at glucose, but looking at glucose, our glucose concentrations tell us about what's going on in our body. It's not inherently glucose being high is bad. Glucose being high is bad because your body cannot clear it. It's the fact that your body cannot clear it that is bad. We just look at glucose concentrations because it's easy to look at and it's indicative of your body not being able to clear it, especially if we're looking at chronic levels of glucose. However, anytime you eat carbs, glucose goes up. The important thing, as Adrian mentioned, is that your body is able to clear it. What does it mean by your body clearing blood glucose? It essentially means that different tissues in your blood, like your different organs, muscle, etc., can take that glucose from the blood and use it for energy efficiently, right? If your blood glucose goes down, it means that your body is efficiently using that blood glucose for different metabolic processes. If your blood sugar doesn't go down, it means that your body can't efficiently use it. You have insulin resistance, and those chronically elevated levels of glucose are then going to cause damage, right? And if we talk about the highway, it's the same as saying a lot of
I
cars.
want to step in right here really quickly, though, because I think someone might get the wrong idea of thinking that that's why they need a glucose monitor, is to determine if their glucose is coming down properly.
Sure.
And what all you need to do is get your HbA1c tested.
Yeah.
And if you can't get it through your doctor, you can buy a test online for like $30. It's really easy. That tells you your average blood glucose levels this is an estimate of your average blood glucose levels over the last 3 months.
Yep.
If it's high, then you might want to focus on improving your metabolism and maybe thinking about, the way that you're consuming certain glucose content. Like if you're eating a lot, like ice cream at night and stuff like that, like you might want to think about some of these things. But if your HbA1c isn't high, you don't have to worry about wearing a glucose monitor and paying attention to every single glucose fluctuation. Another analogy that I think I used one time that I think helps some people understand it is measuring your glucose fluctuation to every meal is similar to like weighing yourself after every meal. Yeah. Like if you did that, you would eat less and probably lose weight because you would say, "Oh, I ate this meal and my weight increased less." So you're just gonna eat less food.
Yeah.
And you'll probably lose weight and it'll probably work. And so a lot of people will say, because when I criticize this, I have so many people will come in and say, well, I did what she recommended, or like what these people recommend, and it reduced my glucose levels, or like it reduced my A1C, and it will, it definitely will, but it's paying attention to the wrong thing, and it's just not actually paying. Like you don't need to pay attention to your every glucose fluctuation. You just need to pay attention to your habits, and the habits are what matter in your overall lifestyle and diet. And then if you get your A1C tested regularly, or like once a year, and you make sure that that's in a healthy range, then you don't have to worry about hyper managing this physiological process. That's something like we get sold often on hyper managing our body, on thinking we have to like control every little thing about the way our body works, and we just can't do that.
It's like your body takes care of it. That's what I was saying.
It's exhausting.
Complex, right? It's like your body will take care of it on its own. You don't have to worry about the grams of carbs you ate for breakfast if you're doing all of these healthy behaviors. And eating carbs is extremely healthy. Like there's so much data showing that general population here, people who eat more carbs have better body weight regulation. In carbs in proportion to total calories. I'm not talking about just eating more carbs, right? But like people who consume more carbs as a total percentage of their total calories tend to have better body weight outcomes. Another interesting fact, you can be diabetic and insulin resistance even if you don't eat a ton of carbs, right? Because you can just be overeating energy. You can have insulin resistance. without eating a lot of carbs. Like, that's the funny part, right? Like, actually, mechanistically, if we're going to talk about mechanisms, fat causes insulin resistance more than eating carbs does.
Acutely,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. Acutely, right? And that's the same thing about insulin acutely influencing fat storage, right? It's so complex that you don't have to worry about it. Like, literally.
It's so complex that's why we don't get into the complexities
Yeah,
often, because it's confusing.
it is confusing.
And so I'll have people ask me oftentimes in my Q&As, "Can you explain how this works?" And I'm like,
I can listen to my
that would
podcast.
not help you.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, like that wouldn't be helpful at all.
yeah,
Like, it would be a very complicated thing to understand that would not actually, like, how about I just tell you to drink more water?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's more you don't need to understand all the mechanisms unless you're going into this field. You just need to understand the habits
Yeah,
and build skills in knowledge, or like, once you have that knowledge, build skills around implementing those habits
yeah,
into your life and focus there, instead of trying to learn every little nuance, and because that's going to distract you oftentimes into things that you don't need to know, and then it's going to just take you into misinformation oftentimes, instead of just focusing on, okay, these are the basics, build some skills around implementing that, do that for the rest of your life. Don't make this your whole life. Don't pay attention to it all the time and
yeah.
spend your whole life thinking about nutrition. And because that's what I see a lot of people do, is they're investing too much into it because it becomes overwhelming.
Dude, I can't tell you how many of my clients, and you'll probably have the similar experience, literally tell me, "Wow, your style of coaching just relieves so much pressure." They're like, "This is just like so much easier to follow. I don't have to worry about when I eat or whether it has carbs or whether it's keto or whether XYZ."
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
like, because that shit doesn't matter. Like, there's a reason why you haven't made progress towards your goals and you've been hyper focusing on these things, right? And
For years sometimes,
yes,
like,
dude, it's so sad. It is sad, right? And then when they just start to learn about things that matter and how much flexibility you actually have, right? Because you don't have to focus. The thing is, people focus on the things they shouldn't do rather than just focus on the things that you should do. And when you focus on the things that you should do, you have so much more flexibility and freedom, and you start to realize like how simple this stuff really is, right? I actually have one client, dude, who is an avid listener of both my podcast and your podcast. She loves your podcast. She's always like, "I heard Dr. Adrian's podcast and he said XYZ, and then I heard your podcast and you said the same thing. It's so nice to have you guys." Like, she loves you, man.
love
I'm sure she'll love this podcast and she'll know who I'm talking about when she hears
it.
it, because she listens to every episode, which is great. But and she's actually one of the ones that has been struggling with a lot of these things for a while. But the analogy I wanted to say with regarding the highway, because this will make people understand a little bit of what I mean in terms of like what matters is like your body's ability to clear glucose. It's like cars on the highway are not an issue, right? The issue becomes if there's things like traffic jams, right? Or maybe if an exit is closed and the cars can't get off of the exit, then there's an accumulation, right? It's the same with blood sugar. Think about your bloodstream as the highway, glucose being the cars. The cars are going to different places. As long as the cars can get off in their exit and go where they're going and traffic is flowing, it's all good. As long as glucose is flowing through your blood and your tissues are able to take that glucose and use it, it's all good. That's really what matters. Anyways, we've also been beating this glucose horse. um, what are some final topics we can talk about? I was thinking maybe things like anti-nutrients, stuff like that. What are your thoughts? Any other
I
big
mean, we
ones?
talking about the carnivore stuff already a
Yeah.
little bit, the
But the idea of
anti-nutrient stuff.
anti-nutrients from the perspective of like defense chemicals being bad, hormesis
Yeah,
in particular, right? Inflammation
yeah,
being
yeah,
bad to any degree. That goes, the inflammation thing, chronic versus acute, because we've been talking about inflammation being bad, right? But inflammation isn't inherently bad. Inflammation is only bad similar to glucose if it is continuously elevated, right? Guys, think of it like this, and I just thought of this. All of these processes, right? Cholesterol, blood sugar going up and down, inflammation going up and down. These are all different processes that our body uses to maintain us alive and maintain our physiology functioning properly, right? So these things are supposed to happen. If you had zero inflammation, you would die because you would get an infection and die because you wouldn't be able to fight it off. So all of these processes, if you like literally had zero blood sugar, that would also be very, very, very bad, right? If
Oh,
you
you
had
die.
zero cholesterol, you would die. That would also be very, very bad. So all these things are necessary. It's when these mechanisms get thrown out of whack, right? And when they're thrown out of whack, we can measure certain things that tell us that they're out of whack. Like we can measure our glucose and we can know whether glucose regulation is out of whack or not. Inflammation is no different. Inflammation is not bad. Inflammation is only bad when it's chronically elevated. And that tells us that something's going on with our physiology that isn't the best, right? It's not the fact that inflammation itself is harmful. Inflammation is actually a good thing, right? And so when people make this argument of like oxalates or phytates or lectins, these are all different compounds found in foods that mechanistically have been shown to increase inflammation just the same way like how we talked about omega-6 can increase inflammation
They
mechanistically.
they haven't even, not even with phytates, no, with
I think
lectins just bind to immune cells essentially, and that's it's if those proteins get into the bloodstream undigested. Like it's
yeah,
this would take another hour and a half episode to address each of those because they're all
they're all different.
different. Like,
But a lot of these people
but
hide
none of
behind
them
the
actually
argument.
show negative
Yeah,
outcomes.
none of them show
Like
negative
that's the
outcomes.
important
Yeah, which is
thing.
what we're going to talk about. But so many of these people fearmonger under the argument of inflammation, right? Like these things are so inflammatory. These foods are inflammatory. And, you know, seed oils are a huge one. But I hear a similar argument with the anti-nutrients as well, right? Or perhaps, like you mentioned, anti-nutrients binding to other things and then you
They
can't
talk
absorb
about
other
it with
things.
lectins because you can grab cell culture studies where they'll mix immune cells with various lectins from
Yeah.
food in a cell culture, and then they bind to the immune cells, and so that's where some of that comes from, is like, oh, they cause, an immune response.
Yeah.
And that
Anything causes an immune
that
response if you
yeah,
present them
well,
to immune
and
cells.
that and there's truth to that
Yeah.
too, because I mean, there's, again, just nutrition gets really complicated when we talk about immune responses and digestive health and all
Mhm.
that stuff. That's layers and layers of complication. But um, in the general population, lectin-containing foods are associated with positive health outcomes. When people eat nuts, beans, whole grains, they have improvements in health. Same with phytates, and then all of these, like with phytates, for example, there's actually studies to show that phytates are antioxidant nutrients. So they can inhibit the absorption of some minerals in our body, but typically they come with some of those minerals as well. So like they're inhibiting the absorption of some of the minerals they come with. They don't even, and so what people will tell you is they block the absorption. And there's a difference between
Yeah, there's
block
a
and
big
inhibit.
difference.
Like
Yeah.
they will bind to a little bit of magnesium, a little bit of iron. You absorb a little bit less magnesium and iron, whatever. So you have, if you had, let's say, for example, 10 milligrams of iron, maybe you only absorb 6 because you had some phytates with that meal. But those phytates have antioxidant properties in our body, and they're contained in foods that have positive health effects. So avoiding them for this specific mechanism that someone points out again is just, all of these come down to misrepresented mechanisms again, and where you say like the plant defense compounds, like that. This is just, there's these compounds that are found in tiny quantities in these plants, that if they were, if you concentrated them and put them in high quantities and mix them with cells in a test tube, they can have negative effects. But we eat those plants and they have positive benefits. Like we
Yeah.
we don't, simple, simple information there. And if they don't for you, in some cases, there may be reasons behind it. It may be because you're sensitive to certain compounds in that plant. It may be because that food has certain types of fiber that you can't tolerate well. Typically, they're like, these things can happen, and this is one of the reasons why some of these myths take hold a lot of times, is because they are true for a segment of the population in many cases. And that segment of the population, they've never been heard by anyone else. They don't feel like it. Like if they listen to a general nutrition podcast, they're like, everything this person's telling me doesn't make me feel good. But if this guy told me to go carnivore now and I feel better, like this person is a god to me.
Yeah.
Like they put themselves in a space because they're going, on that side of things, where when someone follows it and it feels good, they think that this person knows everything, and they tell everyone.
Yeah.
And so that's how that stuff goes viral. But there's explanations to all this if if people were getting their information from actual nutrition
Yeah.
professionals. Like the vast majority of information on social media, in bookstores and Barnes and Noble, on podcasts, is it's not nutrition. It's not people who went through any type of formal education whatsoever at all. And I'm not saying that formal education is the end all be all, but you have to learn some biology and some biochemistry, and you have to learn this stuff. You
Yeah.
have to understand the basics in order to be able to understand the more complex stuff.
Yeah, totally.
And oftentimes people think they understand the complex stuff because they don't understand the basics, and it's their complete lack of understanding that makes them think that they can understand the complex stuff.
They don't know
And so
shit.
yeah, exactly. So like
Yeah.
education, and then also experience. Like if
Yeah.
you're taking advice from someone, you probably want. There's great people who haven't, like great people who put out good information, who are well educated, that didn't work with people in this space. But the information is often going to be more simple and more practical if you're taking it from someone who has experience in working with clients.
Totally.
I'm the stuff that the content that I would put out before working with clients versus after is significantly different. And
Same here.
before, it would have been more of the biohacky type stuff because it's just interesting to me.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't have realized, like, oh, I saw this paper on the benefits of sauna, so I'm going to share this and talk about how cool it is, and then everyone's going to think they have to sauna every day. And it's I used to do that stuff more in my content early
Yeah.
on, and I realized that people were thinking that they had to do all of these things that I shared about.
Yeah.
And I shifted my content, and then I realized it didn't grow as fast.
Yeah.
But it's fine.
That's so funny. I'm thinking here even myself, like, yeah, the type of content I've made has definitely shifted. Just also because we're always trying to attract a different type of person to our business and all that stuff. But even like when I first started, I remember a post that I made that I would never make now. I was talking about how different polymorphisms in the testosterone gene influence the anabolic effects of testosterone. And it was just like some genes had like more of the freaking what's the term? I'm blanking now.
SMPs or
No, ATGC.
Oh yeah.
What's the term? Wow, now this whole podcast is useless because we just sound like
I don't
idiots.
know.
The you know what I'm talking about. Anyways, the gene had slightly more of those. They're not amino acids, dude. What's wow, dude. Anyways, Adrian and I are idiots. We don't know anything, but
No.
genes essentially are, composed.
Nucleic acids.
Yes, nucleic. Wow. Yes. There were certain testosterone.
I was like, what are you talking about at first?
Yep. Yeah, nucleic.
I had to like think about it and imagine the DNA structure, and I was like, oh, that's what he's talking about.
Anyways, some of them just had slightly more nucleic acids at the end, and that influenced the anabolic properties of the testosterone receptor. It was the gene for the testosterone receptor because that's the protein. And I remember I used to post about those things because I found it fascinating. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Like, we found this out. And just like, what is that? That doesn't help anybody,
It's also stuff that sometimes people post stuff like that, and it's
makes you seem smart.
yes, exactly. It's like it makes you look smart, and I used to do that stuff like kind of for that reason. Not kind of for that reason, but like people are like, oh, this guy's really smart. But at the end of the day, social media is not to show how smart you are. Like, or that's not why I use it. Like, I'm trying to put out content that's going to be helpful, not complicate what you think about health and then think I'm smart in the process. Like that. And that's what so many people are doing is like complicating what we like, just complicating the whole health thing and making themselves sound really smart. Oftentimes they're not even providing correct information.
Yeah. Anyways, man, I think we've been talking about these.
Yeah, we've been going at it. This is a long episode.
Yeah, I love this though, man. This was awesome.
Yeah.
I like talking to you about these things because you're just as passionate about them as I am, and you obviously bring up a ton of interesting points that are things that I haven't even thought about, honestly. Well, We'll have to do another one, bro. You'll definitely be the first
Yeah,
person to be on the show
let me
3
get
times.
a pic for
You
social.
got a pic? Yeah, send it to
for
me too. Recording with the GOAT. That's what you need to say.
I'll, I'll put that up for sure.
All
All
right,
right,
dude.
man.
Well, thank you so much, man. It's been a pleasure, like always. Guys, if you want to, I guess, Adrian, you're going to share this on your podcast too, I think. But if you guys want
Yep.
to follow Adrian, please do at Dr. Adrian Chavez on all social media platforms. Where can people find your course as well?
Your Nutrition Prescription podcast as well. And then my course, you can find it through my social. So just click on the link on my bio and my social. That's the easiest thing to do. And yeah, on Instagram, that's the best place. And I have all the links there.
Yeah, guys, if you like really in-depth topics, Adrian covers those a ton more than I do. I like having more organic conversations. Adrian is not lazy and actually takes time to prepare his topics in a lot of detail. So if you want to
Saves me
learn more
time.
about things like saturated fat, cholesterol, etc., he has episodes on all of those topics where he just talks about them for like 30 minutes. Not gonna lie, it's a little bit boring, but I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's really boring. But at the end of the day, if you come home with some knowledge, it's fine.
Yeah. All right, dude. Well, thank you so much, man. We'll talk soon. See you, bro.
Yeah. Have a good one.